The autumn leaves scattered across the freshly paved driveway of my new home as I carried the last box from the moving truck. This modest three-bedroom ranch house represented everything I had worked toward for over a decade. After years of apartment living, endless saving, and countless property viewings, I had finally found my dream home in what seemed like the perfect neighborhood. Tall oak trees lined the quiet streets, and well-maintained gardens hinted at a community that cared about their surroundings without being obsessive. I set the box down in the entryway, which was already crowded with stacks of unpacked belongings. The chaos of moving was evident in every corner of the house. Furniture wrapped in protective blankets stood at odd angles, waiting to find their permanent places. Kitchen items spilled out of half-unpacked boxes, and my clothes remained mostly in suitcases. I had given myself a full week off work to get settled, but even that seemed insufficient for the mountain of tasks ahead. The unexpected sound of the doorbell cut through my planning. I navigated through the maze of boxes to answer it, assuming it might be a friendly neighbor offering a welcome basket or introduction. The woman standing on my porch had perfectly highlighted blonde hair styled in that distinctive angled bob that had become synonymous with a certain type of suburban enforcer. Her immaculate white blouse was accessorized with a pearl necklace that gleamed in the afternoon sun, and her posture exuded authority. Her smile was practiced but never reached her eyes, which scrutinized me with barely concealed judgment. "Hello there. I am Deborah Winters, president of the Sycamore Creek Homeowners Association," she announced, her voice carrying the artificial warmth of someone performing a duty rather than extending a genuine welcome. "I see you have moved in and wanted to personally welcome you to our community." Before I could properly introduce myself, she produced a clipboard from her designer handbag and flipped to a form with practiced efficiency. "However, I must inform you that your lawn does not currently meet our community standards. The grass exceeds our 3-inch height maximum in several areas, and there appears to be some clover growing in the northwest corner." I glanced at my lawn, bewildered. The previous owners had maintained it well, and while it might not have been perfectly manicured after a week without attention during the moving process, it hardly seemed worthy of a formal complaint. "I just moved in yesterday," I explained. "I have not even had time to unpack my kitchen utensils." "We understand transitions can be challenging," Deborah replied without a hint of actual understanding. "But our standards must be maintained regardless of personal circumstances. Our property values depend on consistent aesthetic compliance." She thrust a pink violation notice into my hands. "You have 72 hours to remedy the situation, or a $50 fine will be assessed." I accepted the notice reflexively, too stunned to argue. She departed with a quick pivot, strutting back to her pristine white SUV parked at the curb. I stood in my doorway, violation notice in hand, watching her drive away and wondering if this was simply the price of suburban living. Perhaps this was normal, a neighborhood ritual of initiation I had to endure as a newcomer. That evening, I set aside my unpacking to mow the lawn, despite the exhaustion that had settled into my bones after days of moving heavy furniture and boxes. As I pushed the mower across the grass, I noticed several neighbors watching from behind curtains or while pretending to check their mail. No one approached or offered help. Their furtive glances communicated something I did not yet understand but would soon discover. Little did I know this first encounter with Deborah Winters would spiral into a neighborhood saga that would test my patience, my research skills, and ultimately my resolve to stand up for what is right. The next week passed in a blur of unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and attempting to transform the empty house into a home. Every evening after work, I would tackle another room until exhaustion forced me to stop. The living room slowly took shape with bookshelves filled and pictures hung. The kitchen cabinets now contained organized dishes and cookware. My bedroom provided a sanctuary from the chaos that still reigned in other parts of the house. My focus on settling in was regularly interrupted by the appearance of new violation notices. They materialized with alarming frequency, sometimes tucked into my door frame, other times boldly taped to my mailbox. Each pink slip detailed another infraction I had supposedly committed against the sacred HOA covenant, printed in a vicious font that conveyed both authority and disdain. The second notice arrived just 3 days after the first. Trash receptacles must not be visible from the street except between 5 p.m. the day before collection and 8 p.m. on collection day. A $75 fine was noted for my garbage can being visible for approximately 2 hours longer than permitted after the garbage truck had passed. 2 days later, another pink slip appeared. Exterior equipment must be stored out of sight at all times. The offense was a ladder I had leaned against the garage for one afternoon while cleaning the gutters. The fine was $100. By the end of the week, more violations accumulated. The curtains I had hung in my bedroom window warranted a $150 fine for unapproved window treatments installed without prior written consent from the architectural committee. I had planted a small row of marigolds along my front walkway without submitting the required landscape modification form, resulting in another $100 penalty. I attempted to comply with each citation while continuing to unpack. The trash cans were hidden behind a lattice screen. The ladder was stored in the garage. I completed the landscape form in triplicate and submitted it through the HOA website. But the violations kept coming, their frequency increasing rather than diminishing despite my efforts. When passing neighbors on the sidewalk, I noticed sympathetic glances. Some would quicken their pace, avoiding conversation. Others offered hushed warnings. "Be careful about your holiday decorations," a young mother whispered one morning as she pushed a stroller past my driveway. "They fined us $300 last year for putting our lights up one day before the approved date." An elderly gentleman who lived 2 doors down slowed his daily walk to murmur, "She made the Johnsons move last year over a birdhouse." A birdhouse. Been here 30 years and never seen anything like her enforcement committee. He shook his head sadly and continued on before I could ask for details. The breaking point came when I returned home from work to find a violation notice with a $200 fine for placing a cheerful garden gnome beside my front steps. "Unapproved yard art is strictly prohibited," the notice stated. "All exterior decorative elements must receive prior written approval from the Aesthetic Standards Committee." That evening, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes and a growing stack of pink violation slips, I spread the HOA documents across my kitchen table. The welcome packet I had received at closing contained the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, a 70-page document of dense legalese that I had previously set aside for later reading. Now, with over $600 in fines accumulated in just 1 week, later had arrived. I poured a glass of wine and began methodically reading each page, highlighting restrictions that seemed especially arbitrary or excessive. No basketball hoops visible from the street. No vegetable gardens in front yards. No wind chimes. No vehicles over 3 years old parked in driveways overnight. No exterior paint colors outside the approved palette of 42 variations of beige, gray, and white. No clotheslines at any time. No bird baths exceeding 18 inches in height. As midnight approached, my kitchen table covered in papers and my head pounding from the absurdity of it all, I realized this neighborhood suddenly felt less like a dream and more like a carefully manicured prison. The idyllic community I had saved for years to join had revealed itself to be governed by rules that seemed designed to strip away individuality and spontaneity. But something about the frequency and escalation of the violations did not add up. It felt personal, targeted, as though I was being subjected to scrutiny beyond what was normal, even for an overzealous HOA. The epiphany came at 2:17 a.m. as I scrutinized the HOA boundary map for the fourth time, comparing it to my property deed. My eyes were burning from hours of reading, and my dining room table had disappeared under stacks of documents. Property plats, HOA bylaws, county records I had downloaded from the public database, all spread out in a chaotic collage of text and boundary lines. I had almost missed it. The HOA coverage map included in the welcome packet showed a clean, professional rendering of Sycamore Creek Estates, with lot numbers neatly labeled within the subdivision boundaries. My finger traced the line that marked the eastern edge of the development, following it north until it reached the curved section where my street began. And then I noticed something peculiar. The boundary line stopped precisely 3 feet before reaching my property line. I pulled out my original deed and property survey, comparing the lot number and description to the HOA map. According to these official documents, my house sat on Lot 47 of the original Oak Hill development, not within Sycamore Creek Estates at all. I checked and rechecked the coordinates, measuring with a ruler against the scale provided. The realization washed over me like a wave. My house, my dream home, sat squarely outside HOA jurisdiction. Sleep evaded me as questions raced through my mind. Was this an error? A misunderstanding? Had the previous owner been paying HOA dues unnecessarily? Or had Deborah Winters been knowingly issuing violations to a property outside her authority? The next morning, bleary-eyed but energized by my discovery, I drove to the county record's office. The building was a relic from another era, with worn tile floors and the distinct smell of old paper. I approached the main desk where a woman in her 60s looked up from her computer. "How can I help you today?" she asked, adjusting her reading glasses. "I need to confirm the development history and HOA jurisdiction for my property," I explained, sliding my deed across the counter. "I believe there may be a discrepancy." The clerk, whose nameplate identified her as Margaret, examined my documents with practiced efficiency. "Let me pull up the historical plat maps," she said, typing commands into her ancient-looking computer system. After several minutes of searching and cross-referencing, Margaret motioned me around the counter to view her screen. "You were right to check," she confirmed, pointing to faded boundary lines on an ancient plat map. "Your property is technically part of the original Oak Hill development. Sycamore Creek was developed later by a different builder and stops right at your eastern property line. So my home is not legally part of the Sycamore Creek HOA?" I asked, needing explicit confirmation. "Not according to county records," Margaret replied. "Oak Hill never established an HOA, and your property was never annexed into Sycamore Creek's jurisdiction. You are essentially on an island of non-HOA land surrounded by their development." My request for official copies of all relevant documents was met with understanding efficiency. Margaret printed boundary maps, development histories, and a certified letter confirming my property status. "This happens more often than people realize," she explained while collating the papers. "Developments expand, boundaries get confused, and sometimes HOAs attempt to extend their reach beyond their legal authority." Armed with official documentation and righteous indignation, I called Deborah Winters that afternoon. My hands trembled slightly as I dialed the number listed on the violation notices, my kitchen table now organized with evidence rather than chaos. Her voice was crisp and professional when she answered. Deborah Winters speaking. Hello, Mrs. Winters. This is your neighbor from 1478 Oak Ridge Drive, I began, keeping my tone neutral. I am calling about the violation notices you have been leaving at my property. Yes, you have several outstanding compliance issues, she replied immediately. The fines will continue to accrue interest if not paid promptly. That is the issue I want to discuss, I continued. I visited the county record's office today and discovered my property is not actually part of Sycamore Creek Estates. I am located in the original Oak Hill development, which has no HOA. Her laughter crackled through the phone, dismissive and condescending. Oh, that is ridiculous. Everyone in this area is part of our association. I have certified documentation proving otherwise, I insisted. The boundary line for Sycamore Creek stops 3 feet before my eastern property line. You have no legal jurisdiction over my property. Listen, her voice hardened, dropping all pretense of pleasantness. I do not know what game you think you are playing, but this will not end well for you. If you want to be difficult, I can assure you my enforcement committee will be paying much closer attention to your property. The threat hung in the air between us, but for the first time since moving in, I felt something stronger than intimidation. I felt the solid ground of truth beneath my feet. I am not asking for special treatment, Mrs. Winters. I am simply informing you that I am not legally bound by your HOA rules, and I will not be paying any fines you have issued or may issue in the future. We will see about that, she snapped before ending the call. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the phone. The battle lines had been drawn, but I had not anticipated how quickly or aggressively the war would escalate. The war began in earnest after our phone confrontation. My refusal to acknowledge her authority transformed Deborah from merely overbearing to openly hostile. The very next morning, I spotted her silver SUV cruising slowly past my house, her phone camera aimed through the passenger window at my front yard. By noon, she had driven by 3 more times, documenting every detail of my property with the precision of someone gathering evidence for prosecution. That evening, I returned from work to find not 1 but 3 violation notices wedged into my door frame. The fines had escalated dramatically. $500 for unauthorized landscape stones around my maple tree, $300 for excessive ornamental grasses near my front walkway, and $700 for a non-conforming mailbox post that had come with the house and matched every other mailbox on the street. I collected the pink slips, added them to my growing file of evidence, and resolved not to engage directly yet. This was clearly an intimidation tactic, and I needed to prepare my defense properly before confronting her again. The next day followed the same pattern, with Deborah's vehicle appearing like clockwork every few hours. By the weekend, neighbors had begun to notice the unusual scrutiny my home was receiving. A young couple across the street gave me sympathetic waves when they saw me retrieving yet another violation notice from my porch. The elderly gentleman who had warned me about the Johnsons left a plate of cookies on my step with a note reading simply, "Stay strong." When I found Deborah actually measuring the height of my shrubbery on Sunday morning while I was retrieving my newspaper, I decided more direct action was needed. "Mrs. Winters," I called out from my front door, "I must ask you to leave my property immediately." She straightened up, measuring tape still in hand. "This is HOA business," she replied dismissively. "As president, I have the right to inspect for violations." "Not on my property, you do not," I countered, stepping onto my lawn. "As I explained on the phone, my home is not part of your HOA and you are trespassing." Her eyes narrowed. "If you continue this absurd charade, things will only get worse for you. People who fight the association always regret it. After she departed, I immediately ordered a comprehensive security camera system online, expediting the shipping. The cameras arrived 2 days later, and I installed them that evening, covering my front yard, backyard, side entrances, and driveway. Each camera connected to my home network, storing footage both locally and in cloud storage, with motion-activated alerts sent directly to my phone. The investment proved its worth immediately. The very next day, while I was at work, my phone buzzed with multiple alerts. The footage showed Deborah boldly walking into my backyard with a ruler, kneeling to measure my grass height with the precision of a scientist cataloging specimens. She moved methodically around my property, peering through windows, opening my garden shed, and photographing every corner as if documenting a crime scene. That evening, 5 new violation notices awaited me, totaling over $2,000 in fines. The most outrageous claimed I had violated Section 7.4 of the Aesthetic Standards by having non-compliant interior window coverings visible from common areas. The next morning, I contacted a lawyer. Sarah Jenkins specialized in property disputes and HOA conflicts. Her office was modest but professional, lined with legal texts and framed credentials that inspired confidence. "This is quite straightforward," she concluded after reviewing my documentation and security footage. "Your property is unequivocally outside their jurisdiction, and Mrs. Winters is clearly trespassing. What she is doing borders on harassment." Sarah drafted a firmly worded cease and desist letter, outlining the legal boundaries of my property, demanding that all violation notices be rescinded, and warning that continued trespassing would result in legal action. "This is clear trespassing," she explained, sliding the letter into an envelope. "And they have absolutely no jurisdiction over your property. Send this by certified mail to ensure delivery confirmation." I mailed the letter that afternoon, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in weeks, I slept soundly, believing that official legal notification would surely end the conflict. That illusion was shattered 2 evenings later when my doorbell rang at 7:45 p.m. Through the peephole, I could see not just Deborah but 4 other people standing on my porch, their faces set in grim determination. I opened the door cautiously, leaving the security chain engaged. "We are the Sycamore Creek HOA board," Deborah announced, gesturing to her companions. "We are here to address your recent communication and ongoing violations." "I have nothing to discuss regarding HOA matters," I replied firmly. "As my attorney has explained, my property is not under your jurisdiction." A tall, balding man stepped forward. "Listen carefully. Troublemakers never last long in this neighborhood. The legal fees alone will bankrupt you before you ever get to court. And accidents happen to properties that fall into disrepair," added a thin woman with a pinched face. "Broken windows, landscaping damage, insurance rarely covers everything." I closed the door without responding, my heart pounding with equal parts fear and outrage. Within minutes, my phone began vibrating continuously with calls from unknown numbers. When I finally answered one, a disguised voice suggested that compliance would be much easier than the alternative. By morning, my voicemail was full of similar messages, each more ominous than the last. Sarah advised documenting everything but avoiding direct confrontation while she prepared more substantial legal action. "They are escalating because they know they have no legal standing," she explained. "This kind of intimidation often precedes capitulation when they realize they cannot win legally." What neither of us anticipated was how quickly Deborah would abandon even the pretense of HOA authority and descend into outright vandalism and intimidation. My dining room transformed into an intelligence center as I mapped every incursion onto my property. A large cork board displayed printed screenshots from security footage, each labeled with dates and times. A calendar tracked each violation notice, each trespassing incident, each threatening message. I created a spreadsheet documenting every interaction, categorizing them by type of harassment and potential legal violations. Each security camera had been strategically placed to leave no blind spots. The footage automatically backed up to cloud storage and meticulously labeled. I installed additional lighting with motion sensors around the perimeter of my property, ensuring that nighttime intrusions would be clearly recorded. While gathering evidence, I also conducted research into Deborah Winters and the Sycamore Creek HOA. Public records revealed a history that confirmed my suspicions. 3 families had moved out of the neighborhood in the past 18 months rather than continue fighting against violation notices. 2 others had capitulated to demands despite having properties that, like mine, appeared to fall outside HOA boundaries based on county records. Most revealing were the court documents I discovered through the county legal database. One homeowner had filed harassment charges against Deborah 3 years prior, providing evidence similar to what I was now collecting. The case had mysteriously been dropped just before the scheduled hearing, with no explanation filed with the court. When I contacted the former resident, now living in another state, they refused to discuss the matter but warned me to be careful before abruptly ending the call. Armed with this knowledge, I implemented the next phase of my strategy. I purchased bright red, no trespassing signs and installed them prominently along my property line, making sure they were clearly visible from all approaches. I sent a formal written notice to each HOA board member, reiterating my property status and explicitly prohibiting them from entering my land. Sarah approved of these steps but suggested additional measures. The trespassing signs establish clear notice, she explained. Now we need to document continued violations to build an airtight case. We did not have to wait long. Within hours of installing the signs, my phone buzzed with security alerts. The footage showed Deborah marching purposefully across my lawn in broad daylight, ripping each sign from the ground one by one and carrying them away in a black trash bag. Her actions were deliberate and unhurried, displaying a level of arrogance that suggested she believed herself untouchable. The following day, the cameras captured her returning with her measuring tape and clipboard, boldly entering my backyard despite the certified letters my lawyer had sent to every board member. She spent nearly 30 minutes examining my property, taking photographs and making notes, occasionally smiling directly at one of the cameras as if taunting me. "This is exactly what we needed," Sarah said when I forwarded the footage. "Contact the police immediately and file a formal trespassing report. The sign removal constitutes theft as well." The responding officer, a serious-looking man named Officer Martinez, viewed the footage in silence, his expression growing increasingly concerned as he watched the repeated deliberate entries onto clearly marked private property. "This is textbook trespassing," he confirmed, writing up the report. "And taking those signs is theft, plain and simple. We will contact Mrs. Winters for questioning today." When I explained the overall situation, Officer Martinez shook his head. "Unfortunately, we see this kind of HOA overreach more often than you might think, but this case goes well beyond the usual disputes. This appears to be targeted harassment." He advised me to file for a temporary restraining order based on the documented pattern of harassment, which Sarah helped me prepare immediately. The judge reviewed our evidence the following morning and granted the order, prohibiting Deborah from coming within 100 feet of my property or contacting me directly. The restraining order was served to Deborah that afternoon at the Sycamore Creek HOA office, where she reportedly received it with cold fury. But rather than deterring her, the legal action seemed to push her toward more subtle methods of pressure. That evening, 3 different HOA board members drove slowly past my house, clearly surveilling but careful to remain on public roads. Anonymous flyers appeared in neighbors' mailboxes the next day, warning about property values declining due to non-compliant residents and urging community members to stand united against threats to our neighborhood standards. While my name was never mentioned, the timing and context made the target obvious. I remained steadfast, adding each new incident to my growing documentation. When Deborah sent violation notices through certified mail rather than delivering them personally, I simply returned them unopened with "Not a member of HOA returned to sender" written across the envelopes. What I did not anticipate was how my standoff with Deborah would embolden others in the neighborhood who had suffered similar treatment but had been too intimidated to speak up. The ripple effect was about to transform my personal battle into a community uprising. The ripple effect of my police report spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. What began as nervous whispers evolved into open conversations as neighbors began sharing their own stories of encounters with Deborah and her enforcement committee. My mailbox, previously filled with violation notices, now contained handwritten notes from neighbors expressing support and sharing their own experiences. The first to reach out was Linda Thompson, a single mother who lived 3 doors down. Her note described receiving violations for a basketball hoop that her son used, despite having received verbal approval from a previous board member. "They fined me $750 before I took it down," she wrote. "My son still asks why he cannot play in our driveway anymore." More communications followed. The retired couple on the corner had been cited for their bird feeder being 2 inches taller than regulations allowed. The young family across the street had faced weekly violations when their newborn's medical needs prevented them from bringing in their trash cans by the designated hour. Each story revealed a pattern of selective enforcement, personal vendettas disguised as violations, and exorbitant fines for minor infractions. My email inbox filled with accounts from current and former residents. I created a secure online folder to organize these testimonials, building a comprehensive picture of how the HOA had been operated under Deborah's leadership. The pattern became clear. Those who questioned authority were targeted relentlessly until they either moved away or surrendered. Most shocking were the emails from 7 different homeowners who, after checking their property documents at my suggestion, discovered they too had never legally been part of the Sycamore Creek HOA. Their homes, like mine, fell within the boundaries of the original Oak Hill development or other adjacent properties that had been incorporated into Sycamore Creek through questionable means. Recognizing the need for a larger forum to share information, I reserved the community center meeting room for a Saturday afternoon, creating simple flyers inviting residents to discuss property boundaries and homeowner rights. I was prepared for a modest turnout of perhaps a dozen interested neighbors. Instead, the room overflowed with residents. People stood along the walls and sat cross-legged on the floor after all chairs were taken. They clutched property deeds and boundary maps, their expressions shifting from curiosity to disbelief, and finally to anger as I presented my findings and invited others to share their experiences. A local news reporter sat in the back corner, scribbling notes frantically as person after person stood to share their stories. What had begun as my personal boundary dispute had exposed a system of control and financial exploitation that had affected dozens of families over many years. The watershed moment came when elderly Mr. Peterson shakily rose to his feet, his voice cracking with emotion. "I have lived in my house for over 20 years," he began. 17 years ago, they started sending me letters saying I needed to pay HOA dues and comply with their rules." The room fell silent as he continued, tears welling in his eyes. "They threatened to put a lien on my house if I did not join and pay all past dues they claimed I owed. I was recently widowed and terrified of losing my home." He paused, steadying himself against a chair. "I paid them nearly $30,000 over the years for fear of losing my home. And now you tell me I was never legally required to be part of their association at all." The collective gasp that filled the room transformed individual grievances into collective outrage. People began comparing property documents, identifying boundary lines, and discovering that nearly 25% of the homes receiving violation notices and paying dues were actually outside the legal HOA boundaries. The reporter approached me after the meeting, requesting an interview and copies of my documentation. "This could be much bigger than just your neighborhood," she explained. "We have received similar complaints from other developments, but never with this level of evidence." As people lingered after the formal meeting, exchanging contact information and forming impromptu discussion groups, I realized that my strategic response to Deborah's harassment had evolved into something much more significant. What had begun as one homeowner standing up to an overreaching HOA president had become a community awakening to years of potential fraud and intimidation. The following morning, as I drank my coffee and watched the sunrise from my front porch, a porch now free of violation notices for the first time since I moved in, my phone rang. It was a board member I had never met, his voice hushed and nervous. "There is an emergency board meeting tonight," he whispered. "The other members do not know I am calling you, but you should know that financial records are being reviewed. Things are about to change dramatically." I thanked him for the information, feeling not triumph but a somber responsibility to ensure that justice would finally come to Sycamore Creek. The emergency HOA board meeting held in the wake of the community uprising was closed to the public, but the results were impossible to contain. By the following morning, word had spread throughout the neighborhood that Deborah Winters had been removed as president pending a full audit of HOA finances. 3 other board members had resigned, citing personal reasons that everyone understood to be fear of legal consequences. The interim board president, a retired accountant named Robert Chen, who had only recently moved to the neighborhood, contacted me directly to apologize for the harassment I had endured. "The preliminary financial review is troubling," he admitted during our conversation. "We have discovered significant discrepancies between the violation fines collected and the amounts deposited into the HOA accounts." The full audit would eventually reveal the shocking truth that thousands of dollars in fines had been directed into personal accounts rather than HOA coffers. Deborah had created a separate bank account under a similar name to the official HOA account, allowing her to deposit certain fines, particularly those from homeowners outside the legal boundaries, without oversight from the board treasurer. The class action lawsuit came together quickly, with 23 homeowners joining forces under Sarah's legal guidance to reclaim years of fraudulently collected fees and fines. My role shifted from target to inadvertent community organizer, as neighbors began gathering at my home to share information and support one another through the legal process. Elderly Mr. Peterson became the face of the lawsuit, his 17 years of unnecessary payments representing the longest-running case of financial exploitation. His gentle demeanor and obvious distress made the situation relatable to everyone who heard his story. When the local news featured his interview, complete with footage of him showing violation notices for his bird feeders and garden decorations, the public response was immediate and overwhelming. The day Deborah was served papers at her immaculate colonial home became neighborhood legend, with multiple accounts of her face draining of color as she realized the full extent of her vulnerability. Her husband, a quiet man rarely seen at community events, reportedly moved out the following week, taking their luxury car and leaving her to face the mounting legal challenges alone. The county prosecutor opened an investigation into potential criminal fraud charges based on the financial evidence uncovered during the audit. Deborah listed her house for sale within days, but the public nature of the scandal made finding a buyer difficult, even in a desirable neighborhood. For those of us whose properties had been confirmed to be outside HOA boundaries, the sweetest victory came in the form of freedom. We established the Oak Hill Garden Club as an informal, voluntary association focused on community beautification and connection, rather than enforcement and penalties. Our first project was helping elderly Mr. Peterson restore his garden to the glory he had always envisioned before restrictions had limited his creativity. On a bright spring morning, 6 months after my first encounter with Deborah Winters, I joined a dozen neighbors at Mr. Peterson's home. We arrived with plants, garden tools, and a whimsical collection of decorations he had selected, items that would have each earned hefty fines under the previous regime. Bird baths, solar lights, colorful plant pots, and his prized collection of garden gnomes transformed his yard into a personal expression of joy. Standing beside him as he placed a handcrafted birdhouse next to a vibrant flower bed, I reflected on the journey from intimidated newcomer to community defender. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he stepped back to admire our work. "I have not felt this free in my own home for nearly 2 decades," he confessed, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Every day I feared another pink slip, another demand for payment." The class action suit would eventually be settled out of court, with affected homeowners receiving compensation for illegitimate fees and emotional distress. The new HOA leadership established transparent policies and accurate boundary maps, acknowledging that many homes had been improperly included in their jurisdiction. The property line that had once divided us had ultimately united us in something far more meaningful than enforced conformity. It had given us authentic community built on mutual respect, and the freedom to create homes that truly reflected our individual dreams. As neighbors gathered for our first Oak Hill Garden Club potluck dinner, with children playing freely on lawns and adults chatting across property lines without fear of violation notices, I realized that sometimes the most beautiful gardens grow precisely where boundaries are properly understood and respected.